So, having seen functions on arrays and lists, let us move to graphs, which are very interesting objects to study in computing. So, we know that a graph is a useful way to visualize a relation. So, let us imagine this relation. So, we are talking about a class in which you have, or an institution in which you have teachers and courses, right, and you have some allocation of courses to teachers. So, you have two types of objects. You have teachers who are people, and you have courses which are to be taught, and you can describe this allocation as a relation, right. So, you can say A, the allocation, is a subset of T cross C. It is a binary relation which consists of pairs of the form T comma C, where T is a teacher and C is a course, right. So, there are many possible pairs T cross C, and we are not taking all of them, but some of them. So, this is a binary relation, and what we see on the right is a representation of this as a graph, right. So, right now it is very clear that we have these nodes, okay. So, we have one node for every object of interest. In this case, we have two different types of objects, but in the graph we do not, we label them maybe, but we represent them in the same way as black dots. So, on the left hand side we have the teachers, on the right hand side we have the courses, and then we draw these edges, right, these arrows from a teacher to a course. So, there is a direction to this edge, right, and this arrow indicates that this teacher is going to be teaching that course, and of course, there could be situations where two different teachers teach the same course, right. So, this could happen. You could also have a situation where the same teacher is teaching two different courses, which is not captured in this particular example, but of course, you could have that somebody is teaching both biology and history, for instance. Here is another typical relationship that we describe using graphs. So, supposing you have a group of people and some of them are friends with others, then the notion of being a friend again describes certain pairs. So, some pairs of people are friends and some pairs are not friends. So, those who are friends you connect by an edge, and now we can assume that friendship is a symmetric relation. So, if I am somebody's friend, then that person is also my friend, right. So, therefore, if P is a friend of Q, then Q should be a friend of P. So, then we have a graph like this, where now technically speaking we have arrows representing pairs in both directions. So, we have an arrow from P to Q saying that Q is a friend of P, and we have an arrow from Q to P saying that P is a friend of Q, and because we have arrows always in both directions, we just ignore them and draw only a single edge. So, formally a graph is a set of vertices, those are the black dots, so they are called vertices, or sometimes they are called nodes, right, and we take them and connect them using edges. So, this edge technically is a binary relation. It says some pairs of vertices. So, there is a whole, all the pairs of vertices are V cross V. Some pairs of vertices are connected by edges, and usually we have the constraint that a vertex is not connected to itself. Okay. So, that is usually one of the constraints that we have. So, we usually assume that this is, in the relational terminology, irreflexive. Okay. So, this graph can have, typically will be directed. So, I will have edges from say P to Q, and I need not have for every such edge an edge back from Q to P. So, a very particular example of a directed graph was the thing with teachers and courses, because the edges all point from teachers to courses. It does not make sense in such an interpretation to think of an edge starting at a course, because a course cannot teach something else, right. So, these edges represent who teaches what. So, the left hand side has to be a who, and the right hand side has to be a what. On the other hand, the friendship graph that we constructed, as we said, is symmetric, right. So, we have edges between two pairs in both directions or not at all. We never have a situation where P is a friend of Q, but Q is not a friend of P, and in such situations we will just ignore the edges and just draw these with these lines connecting the vertices. So, basically an undirected graph is a graph in which all the edges are symmetric. So, we can effectively think, so we will think still represented by edge in both directions, because we can traverse this edge in both directions. So, if you want, you can think of these as roads. So, if these are two locations served by a road, if you have a directed road, then you can only go from one direction from one to the other, you can't come back on that road. Whereas, if you have a bidirectional road, then it is an undirected road, you can go in either direction. So, one of the key things that we are interested in graphs are sequences of edges which take us from one node to another node, right, and this is what is called a path. So, here we see two paths. We see this red path which takes us from the node representing Priya to the node representing Radhika, and the other one is a blue path which also connects Priya to Radhika, but through a different sequence of intermediate nodes, right. So these could represent, for instance, routes by which some information that Priya wants to convey, or some object, supposing Priya wants to send something which is precious, not to be sent by courier or post, by hand to Radhika, then Priya has to find some of her friends who can in turn find their friends, and so on, who finally will be able to find someone who knows Radhika and pass it on, right. And here we see that there are at least two different ways to do this. So normally when we are talking about paths in a graph, a path does not visit a vertex twice. So here, for instance, we have this red path here, or red sequence of edges, which certainly could be seen as a sequence where every consecutive thing is part of the edge relation, right. So we start, for instance, here. So we start here and we go from Kumar to Firoz, and then Firoz to Colin, then Colin to Aziz, and then Aziz to Priya, then we come back to Firoz, and then we come here, right. So this is technically a sequence of edges, each of which extends the previous sequence by a valid point, but we are not going to call this a path. When we encounter such things, we will usually call it a walk, right. So paths in directed graphs obviously have to respect the arrows, right. So if I have, for instance, an airline route, so this is a typical thing that one sees in real life in graphs. You see these route maps of trains or planes, and they describe which pairs of cities are connected by flights. So let us assume that these are some flights for an airline operating in India, and say that V0 represents Delhi and V9 represents Madurai. Then what we want to know is whether we can take flights within this airline and travel from Madurai to Delhi, which means can I take a sequence of edges starting at V9 and reach V0. And here, for instance, there is this red sequence of edges that you can see, the ones that have been drawn here, right. So this red sequence of edges does represent one way of taking flights, a long sequence of flights, in this case 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 flights to get from Madurai to Delhi. So if this happens, then we say that the target is reachable, right. So it could happen that things are reachable, it could happen that things are not reachable, right. So if they are reachable, then one of the questions that we might ask is, among all the different ways of reaching, what is the shortest way? Other thing you might ask is, where all can I reach? So there are many different questions depending on the context that you might ask about reachability. And of course, one of the things that you might want to know is the graph is connected. Are all the vertices reachable from each other, or do you get stuck somewhere, right? So if you look at this graph, for instance, if you take this edge from V4 to V3 and you put it in only one direction, then I claim that you can still reach from everywhere to everywhere, because earlier you could go directly from V3 to V4, but now you can still do the same thing by going around, right. So if you want, what is now missing is the ability to go from V3 to V4, because I removed this edge, right. So this edge is gone, but now I can still go from V3 to V6, V6 to V5, V5 to V7, and V7 to V4. So the ability to go from V3 to V4 has not changed. It has become a little more tedious, but it is not impossible. So this graph, if it was connected earlier, remains connected even though we have removed one edge. On the other hand, supposing we take this edge between V4 and V0, right, and we make it in a single direction. So earlier I could come from V0 to V4. Now if I remove this, the question is, can I come? Well, if I start at V0, I can go to V1, from V1 I can go to V2, from V2 I can go back to V0, but I can go nowhere else, right. So if I am now in this upper triangle of V0, V1 and V2, I am stuck there, I cannot come to the lower part of the graph. So now the graph is not connected anymore. So the question that we want to ask is the graph that is presented to us connected or not? And this can have many implications. So reachability is not the only kind of question that we are interested in graphs. There are many other kinds of things which can be modeled and solved as graphs. So for instance, here is a problem which superficially does not seem to require graphs, which is to color a map properly. So when we color a map properly, we want two neighboring states or two neighboring countries which share a border to have different colors. So one of the questions that you can ask is, how many colors do we need? So to transfer this to a graph problem, what we do is we first create a vertex for every state that needs to be colored. And now we want to express this constraint that neighboring states should have different colors. So we have to capture this neighboring relation. So we do that by connecting them together. So we attach an edge between every pair of states which shares a border. So now we have a graph. And now what is our constraint? Our constraint is we must assign a color to every one of these black dots such that if two black dots are connected by an edge, they must have different colors, right? So we must assign colors to nodes so that the endpoints of an edge have different colors. You cannot have a green on one side and a green on the other side, because that would mean two neighboring states have the same color, right? So this is called the map coloring problem. But notice that by coming up with this graph representation, we have abstracted the problem so that we are now no longer worried about the shapes of the states, the sizes of the states, the the kind of orientation of the boundary, how much of a boundary do they share. All we are really interested in is this picture, which is what are the underlying states and how are they connected, right? And once we have this, it actually doesn't even need to respect the true physical geography. So I can take some of these nodes and move them aside. I can make the graph look different superficially without changing the underlying nature that is relevant to the problem, namely which points are neighbors of which other points. So this is called the graph coloring problem. So we are given a graph and we are given a set of colors, and what we want to do is assign a color to every vertex such that no pair of adjacent vertices, that is no vertices which are connected by an edge, have the same color, right? So this is what it's saying. If UV are edges if UV is an edge, then the color assigned to U should not be the color assigned to V. So the question that we were asking in that map coloring problem is, what is the smallest set of colors that we need, right? So there is a very famous theorem in graph theory which says that if you have what's called a planar graph. So a planar graph is something which you can draw without any crossing edges. So if you go back to the graph that we had before, you will notice that in this thing there are no, so here we have an edge which is crossing, right? But actually you can take this edge and you can drop it and you can instead draw the same edge. So remember we said that we can modify this graph so long as we don't change anything which is intrinsic to the graph. So we can take that edge and move it to the outside of the graph, right? Edges don't have to be straight lines, they are just something which connects vertices together. And now I claim that we have the same graph in which no two edges actually cross on the paper. So if you can draw a graph like this, this is what's called a planar graph. And it's not difficult to see that if you draw a map, a physical map of countries or of states, and you take the graph that we constructed based on the borders, it's actually going to be a planar graph. And it turns out that for planar graphs, graphs which can be drawn without having edges crossing each other, you can actually color such graphs always with 4 colors. If it is not planar, this is not true, and then it becomes a computationally interesting question to ask what is the minimum number of colors, and it's actually one of these problems for which there is no efficient algorithm known. So you might ask, where do we need to apply this, because coloring seems to be derived from this map question, and for the map question we know the answer is 4 because it's planar. So why do we need to worry about non-planar graphs? So the thing is, there are many other questions which can be reduced to graph coloring. So here is one, right? So supposing you are running a school or a college and you need to allocate classrooms for the classes that are running. So you have a timetable. So in this timetable, this is kind of the time is shown from left to right. So at the beginning of the day you have a maths class. Before the maths class ends, an English class starts. Before the English class ends, history and science start. But notice that science starts after maths ends, right? So the science class does not overlap with the maths class. So now we have 4 different classes which run during the day, but history and science both run after maths, so they both do not overlap with maths. The question that we want to answer now in this particular scenario is, how many classrooms will we need so that no 2 classes are scheduled in the same room at the same time, right? So obviously if we allocate 1 classroom per class, there is no problem. So we could have 4 classrooms for these 4 classes. So we could have an orange classroom for the maths class and a green classroom for the history class and so on. So clearly if we have as many classrooms as there are classes, there is no question, but in almost any institution the number of classes or courses which are taught will obviously exceed the number of rooms that are available. So one of the questions that is interesting is to ask, can we manage with the rooms that we have, right? So what is the minimum number of rooms that we need in order to schedule the classes the way we have done and not have this overlap. So in this case, basically we can think of this edge relation. So the classes that have to be taught are the vertices. The edge relation represents two classes which overlap, and therefore they must fall into different classrooms because they cannot share a classroom. And the classrooms themselves are the colors. So now if two classes are connected by an edge, then they cannot be assigned the same classroom. So if classrooms are colors, they cannot be assigned the same color. So the edges here represent this overlap, right? So that we mentioned above. So these edges. So for notice that there is no overlap between these two pairs. So there is no edge here and there is no edge here, right? Because maths ends before history and science both start, but history and science overlap with each other. Now as for our coloring algorithm, we are allowed to use the same color for this node as either this node or this node because they are not connected, right? So one possible way of reducing the number of classrooms here is to reuse the green classroom for maths that we are going to later use for history. We could also equivalently reuse the gray classroom that we use for science. So this is a situation where we can make do with 3 colors even though we have 4 classes. And of course, if you have a more complicated schedule, then it's a more interesting question to ask how many minimum classrooms you need to have in order to fit that schedule, or you have to change the schedule to adapt to the number of classes, because of course you can't change the number of rooms very easily. So you can change the schedule. So you might have to change the schedule in order to make it fit within the infrastructure that you have. So let's look at another problem. So here is a problem which is to do with security cameras. So as you know, security cameras are placed in such a way that they capture as much of the surroundings as they can, and you want to minimize the number of security cameras. So supposing you are in a hotel and the hotel has corridors, you would ideally place your cameras at intersections of corridors, and let's assume that the camera can rotate around and see all the corridors which meet at a point, right? So a camera can monitor all the corridors. So if supposing you have a lift here, right, and then after you come out of the lift you have, say, corridors which look like this, then if you place a camera at this point, it can see all these 3 corridors, right? So this is the kind of placement that we want. So what is the minimum number of cameras that you need if you know the layout of the corridors in your hotel? So here we would like to represent the floor plan as a graph. So the intersections now become the meeting points of these corridors. So the actual intersections of your corridors become the vertices, right? And now from each vertex, we said that if we put a camera here, for instance, right, it can monitor all these 4 corridors which there, right? So the edge represents a corridor which is incident at an intersection, right? And this edge says that there is a corridor which goes from intersection V2 to intersection V3. And now the question is, where should we put our cameras, right? So this says we must choose some vertices. So supposing I choose V2, then V2 covers all of these, right? But I want to monitor every corridor in my hotel. So from V2, I cannot monitor this particular corridor. So I need to add one more camera. So I could put it at V0 or at V1. So let me put it at V1. So if I now place my cameras at V2 and V1, then every corridor on this map is actually monitored, right? So this is what is called a vertex cover. It is a set of vertices such that every edge has one endpoint in this set, right? So either one end or the other end of the edge must be in the set. So every endpoint, every corridor is monitored by one of these cameras. And the question here computationally is, again, of course, I can put a camera everywhere and then I will obviously cover all the corridors. But what is the smallest number of intersections that I need to place cameras at? Or in other words, what is the smallest vertex cover that I can achieve? A related problem is what is called an independent set. So here let's look at this scenario, right? So we have a kind of fine arts academy which can put up various cultural programs including some group dances. Now in a group dance, of course, a number of people are involved, and it could be that some dancers are trained to dance in more than one group dance. So suppose this academy wants to put up a cultural program, right? Each dance requires the person performing to wear some elaborate costume. So it is not really feasible for a dancer to take part in 2 dances in the same evening, because he or she will have to change their costume, and that will be very problematic. So now you want to know, given the performers who are available and the dances that are available, what is the maximum number of dances you can actually schedule in this program so that you never have to take a dancer from one dance and have them change their costume and take part in another dance. So in this case, again you can represent each of the dances as a vertex, and you can say that two dances are connected if they need one person to participate in both. So if they have a common member in that group, then they are connected. So here it says that V3 and V7, for instance, somebody is required who will participate in both of them. Similarly, say V5 and V6. But there is no connection between V6 and V8. So anybody who takes part in V6 is guaranteed not to be part of V8 and so on. So in this case, we want to find out what is the maximum number of dances we can simultaneously schedule on a day so that there is no such overlap, right? So here is one such allocation. Supposing we choose V4, then we cannot schedule these dances because they have some overlap, right? On the other hand, there is no overlap with V7, so we can take V7. So V7 will rule out V6, but it does not rule out V5. And if we have done V4, V5 and V7, we still have the possibility of V2 because V2 is not connected to any of these. So these vertices, now unlike our previous situation where the vertices were trying to cover all the edges, here we are saying these vertices should be mutually disjoint from each other. No two vertices that we choose, no two dances that we choose must be connected because they should not share a participant. So in this case we have found 4 such, and this is called an independent set. So we want the largest number of dances. Earlier we wanted the smallest number of cameras, so that was the smallest vertex cover. Here we want the largest number of dances that we can choose simultaneously in a day's program. So this is the maximum independent set. Finally, let's look at a very important problem which is called matching. Right? Suppose we have a class project we are going to assign, and we allow groups of 2 students to do this project together. But we know that for 2 students to do this together, they must be friends. If they don't get along with each other, there is no point assigning them to a group. So we have a graph like the one on the right describing the friends. So it says that V2 is a friend of V4, but for instance V2 is not a friend of V3 because there is no edge there. What we want to know is how many groups can we form from this so that we only pick pairs which are friends. So we want to find a good allocation. So this is a subset. So the allocation that we pick will be a subset of the edges. And once we pick the subset, those will form the groups, and if we have any person who is not paired up with another person, that person will have to work on their own. Right? So maybe this is a complicated project and we would ideally like most people to work in groups. So we want to find the largest such. So here for instance is what is called a maximal matching. Right? So I have paired up these 2, I have paired up these 2. I cannot pair up now 5 with anybody because the only thing 5 can be paired up with is 4, which is already part of another pair, and same with 3. 3 can only be paired up with 1 and 4. So this matching is maximal in the sense that I cannot add any more edges and make it a larger matching from what I have right now. But it turns out that this is not a maximum matching in the sense that this says we can form 2 groups of 2 and then 2 people are left alone. But maybe in the 6 people we can actually form 3 groups of 2 so that everybody has a pair. And yes, indeed it is possible, right? So we can pair up 5 to 4, 3 to 1 and 0 to 2 as we see here. Now everybody is assigned a pair and now everybody is covered. So in this particular case it's quite easy to say that if you have an even number of vertices and you have half as many edges in the matching, that everybody is covered. So in general this could be a question which is, if I give you such a graph and I ask you to match up pairs with this constraint, then what is the largest matching that you can construct? So to summarize, graphs are very interesting because they express relationships in many flexible types of relationships in a very concise way. Graphs can be directed as we saw or undirected. So in an undirected graph, really every edge has a matching edge in the reverse direction. So we can think of it as a single edge which has two directions associated with it. One of the most fundamental questions that we need to ask about graphs is reachability, right? Can I get from one node to another node by a path, which is a sequence of connected edges? But there are a wide range of other problems also which are not directly connected to reachability, which are also interesting. So we saw graph coloring, we saw vertex cover, we saw the independent set problem, we saw matching, right? So these are all a variety of problems which are interesting computational problems on graphs and which have a number of practical implications. So we will study some of these as we go along.